I'm Alan. Welcome to my sewing space. I'm on several Facebook groups, as some of you may know, and I've been asked to do some videos for some of the stuff that I sew. So here we are. What I thought we'd start with, because I've been asked for it, is this, which is the City Shopper bag by Simply Sewing. It's a free pattern that comes with a Simply Sewing magazine. I have made this up before, and I thought it would be a relatively simple pattern to start with to make a bag. Unfortunately, I've not found it quite as simple as it looks. There are only 6 pattern pieces given in the pattern packet, but you do need more. So what I suggest you do first and foremost is to make sure that you understand exactly everything that you need and draft all your other pattern pieces, which is what I do to make sure that I've got enough pieces of fabric to make the bag. The pattern suggests that you actually have two zippered pockets, two zippered pockets on the outside and 2 popper pockets on the inside. I suggest that you use 1 zippered pocket on the outside, 1 zippered pocket on the inside and 1 popper pocket. So I've adjusted my pattern pieces to take that into account. I would also suggest that you read through the instructions, because in this particular one some of the instructions don't quite tie up. The piece of fabric it tells you to cut for the pocket, which then it tells you to split. When you split it, the 2 pieces are actually bigger than the single piece that you've already cut. So make sure that you check things like that. And also check that you've got all the materials that you need. This requires quite a few materials. You need 3 different fabrics for the patchwork on the outside. You can use a contrasting colour for the main body of the bag, and you'll need a lining fabric. You will also need some foam, some thin foam to stiffen the bag, and also some wadding and some interfacing. So make sure you've got all the pieces that you need, including any bits and pieces like zips, etc., because you'll need 2 zips for this, and make sure that you've got all those before you start your project. Otherwise you'll then sort of maybe give up because you've actually got to stop because you've got to order something. So let's have a look at the pattern pieces that we've got. So here are all my pattern pieces and my notions. As you can see, there's actually quite a lot that is required. You've got the bag side pieces. There are 2 sets of this particular pattern piece, as there are for the base as well. I suggest you really only need 1 and then double your fabric to cut it. You're going to need some zips. You're going to need some studs to go on the bottom. Now I have put these in, they're not in the pattern, but I think it helps to keep the fabric from the bag off the ground. And this is a swivel catch for the bag itself. You could use whichever catch you like, but it is suggested to use a swivel catch, and that's what I've used. You need 50 squares, 25 for each side, in 3 different colours for this particular bag. I've already pre-cut mine, and you then need to start sewing them together, which is the next step. But there is one point here: when you actually pin them, make sure the pins are vertical to the edge of the fabric and not across, because that will stop the fabric from moving when you're sewing these seams. Okay, so what we're going to do now is start sewing our pattern pieces together. There's a 1-inch seam allowance on this bag, and you need to make sure the distance between your needle and where you are sewing, the edge of the fabric, is exactly that 1 centimetre. Now for me, luckily enough, the edge of my presser foot is about 1 centimetre. The other thing that you can use is these, which is a seam guide, and if I butt that up, I know that I get a nice neat 1 centimetre line, and as long as the fabric is butted up against that, I know that I'm okay. The other thing always to remember to do is to hold your thread at the back. Make sure both your threads are there, which they are, at the back of the machine, because when you start sewing, the threads will pull. I usually hand turn the first stitch, and then I'll back stitch a couple at the beginning and the end, and then I'll do this for the other 3 pieces in each row, and I'll make all the 5 rows up. So we'll just sew this first one just to show you what's going on. As if I can find my foot pedal, and a couple of back stitches. And because the pins are horizontal, you can just sew right over them. Finish stitch, cut it off, take the pins out, and there we have a nice neat piece of sewing. So I'm going to get on and do the others, and then when we're ready to put the rows together, I'll come back to you. Right, so I have sewn all of my 50 squares together in strips of 5. You may have noticed that I haven't actually ironed them yet or pressed the seams open. That's because what we're going to do is something which is a quilting technique, which is called butting up. So I will show you how to do that in just a moment. Those of you who follow my work may have recognised some of the fabrics. The purple and the Marauders map were from the 50s coat that I made for my flatmate, and the rose pattern is the fabric that I made a dress for her, which is one of the first dresses that I made. So I'm using up some of my remnant material as well, and this is a great pattern for doing that because you can do whatever you like with your patchwork. It's quite important to note that if you're using plain fabric, then it doesn't really matter how you place your fabric, but if you are using patterned fabric like I am, it is quite important to work out your placement before you actually start going. So it took me about a couple of hours to work out where I was going to put all my squares before I started. Anyway, on to the butting up. So what we have to do is, I'll get rid of these 3 and turn these over. So when we're butting up, if we press the seams open as we would normally do, we would actually have quite a big thickness of fabric across every seam, particularly where all my seams join. So what they do in quilting is they press in alternate directions. So what you do is you look for where the fabric naturally wants to fold. So here it's quite clear that because the purple fabric is thicker, that naturally wants to stay like that. So what we're going to do is press those that way so that they stay flat, like so, making sure that, oops, and just make sure that that's straight on that side. Okay. And now, because we've pressed those in those directions, we want to press these in the opposite direction. So when they line up, it's much easier to pin them. So that's how it goes. The rose fabric is the one that I need to make sure goes out. And as I'm ironing, I'm slightly pulling so that the seams are open. And then turn it over that way. So now when we line up, we won't actually have all that bulk. And when we do this, and I'll just show you the front again, it's important that when you line it up, again, when you pin vertically. Don't pin this way because there's movement then in the fabric. If you pin this way with straighter pins than I've got, obviously, then the fabric won't move. So I'm going to continue pinning these now, and then we'll just sew one strip and show you exactly how that looks, and then I'll continue with the rest of the strips. Okay, so my strips are all pinned, and I've got my seam guide here pressed up against the end of my presser foot. I'm going to hold my cotton. I'm going to do a couple of stitches and then back stitch. Technically I don't need to do the back stitch because this seam will then be encased or sewn over with another seam, but because this is manipulated quite a lot and moved quite a lot, I prefer just that little bit of security. So then what you do is you just simply sew right to the end of this particular line. making sure that if you do come to one of these pressed open seams, that you hold it down so that it doesn't kick up when it goes underneath the presser foot. A couple of back stitches at the end. Open. And we're just going to take pins out just so that I can show you. But this is nicely, you can see that one's slightly out, but generally it's nicely lined up. I can live with that because it's a bag, it's not a piece of patchwork that I'm making for a quilt or something, and once we've actually done all the other bits and pieces, that's really not going to notice that much. I'll take more care when I'm pinning it next time. So I'll get on and sew up all the rest, and then I'll press all the seams open and you can see what it looks like. So here we have our patchwork pieces all sewn together. Unfortunately, I had made a bit of a mistake. I thought the seam allowance was 1 centimetre when it's actually ½ centimetre. I only noticed that when I was putting on these bottom pieces. Here, for the bottom of the bag, it's not an issue. All it means is that my bag will be slightly narrower and slightly shorter. And I'll just have to adjust some of the other pattern pieces as I go along, namely the sides. Next step is to fuse on, as you can see I've pressed open my seam allowances, is to fuse on some wadding, and then what we're going to do is we are going to quilt. So we'll fuse on the wadding and then we're going to quilt either side of our seams, here, here, and also along the bottom as well. So this wadding you can get in sort of various different thicknesses. The only thing I would say when you're fusing something is make sure that the bit with the glue is going to the fabric and not to the iron. I've ruined too many irons by not having it moving too fast, not having it the right way round. So we're just going to fuse that on, and then we'll go back over to the sewing machine where I'm going to change my thread colour because I want a slightly different top stitch colour, and then we're just going to start quilting. Back at the sewing machine and ready to start quilting. I've lined up my seam with the edge of my presser foot, but currently my needle is about 1 centimetre away from here, and I don't want it that far away. It's going to make the quilting look too wide. So I've got a wheel where I can actually adjust where my needle is, and this is for zigzag stitch. So I don't know if you can see, but as I turn the wheel, my needle moves across to the right. And when it's at the far right, which is position 6 on my machine, it means that it's now ½ centimetre away from the edge of the presser foot, which is great because it means that my seam now, or my quilting, is going to be ½ centimetre away from that edge. My top stitch colour I have changed to match this purple because I think that would work better than the cotton that I was using. The cotton that I was using was another purple, but it was a lighter purple. You need a lot of cotton for this particular bag, particularly because you've got so much quilting and top stitching and stuff to do. So I've only got a reel left of this particular dark colour, so that's why I'm using that specifically for that. Okay, so this should be a better shot of moving the needle to one side. So as I said before, my needle is at 1 centimetre away from the seam allowance. I want it ½ centimetre away, and I've got a way of doing that. I can move it with the zigzag width or the stitch width dial. So if I move that now, you can see the needle is moving to the right hand side, and if I put this on setting 6, so there's centre and there's to the right, this is setting 6, and now my needle is exactly ½ centimetre away from the seam allowance, or ½ centimetre away from the edge of the presser foot, and that's where I'm going to stitch to give me a nice quilting effect. So here are my two pieces, nicely quilted as you can see, and on the reverse side you can see that I've got the quilting pattern, and they're nice and even. They're 1 centimetre width, which is a nice pattern. Over here I've already pinned the pocket. In the instructions it says to align the top of the pocket with the top of the piece. Unfortunately, if you do that, the zip comes here, which is where the fastening usually happens. I've got a bag here which I've already made, and if you can see, the zip works better in the second panel down because the fastening goes sort of in the first panel. So we're going to attach this in the second panel. Now I've already marked this up here, so the outside line is my stitch line, and then these inside lines and the triangles are my cut lines because I'm inserting a zip, and I'm going to insert a black zip. This is a 7-inch zip. This zip, as you can see, is slightly too big. That isn't a problem because when we position it, it'll be positioned like this, and some of this end won't be used. We're not going to cut it off because it's actually inside the side of the bag, but it will be stitched, so it'll be nice and neat and tidy. I have 2 pieces of fabric which are going to form my pocket, and this is the pattern piece that I made. I decided on the sizes that I was going to use for this, and it's 17 centimeters long by 18 centimeters deep. The ends of the zip fit in at about 1 centimeter each side. The zip is 2.5 centimeters down from the top, and it's 1 centimeter deep. This is sort of standard depth for a zip, and the width depends on the width of your zip. We're now back at the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch down this line, pivoting at the corners all the way round where the zip insertion is going to go. I'll just show you how I get to a corner and turn it, although you probably already know this already, but it's worth looking at. So I start with the needle in, and it's all lined up so that I can just follow the line. I'm going to do a couple of back stitches here. Notice my pins are far enough away from my presser foot that they don't get caught. When I get close to the end, I prefer to turn by hand until I get right into the very, very corner. So I'm in the very corner of my marked piece, and what I've done is I put the needle down. I can now lift my presser foot, turn 90 degrees, realign with my line, which is just there, make sure that that's right, not quite, and then I can start again. I'm just going to hand turn this time, just until I get to the other corner. Because it's only 1 centimeter and it's only a few stitches, there we are, right in the corner again. Because it's only a few stitches, I prefer to hand turn rather than to sew, because I could zip past the end, and we don't want that because we have to be very precise when inserting a zip. So I can now turn this again. I will have some excess fabric which I'm just going to fold over. Make sure, actually it looks like I'm 1 stitch away. There we go. That's better. Realigned back up, and now I'm just going to finish sewing this, and then we'll take it over to actually cut the hole for the zip. So here we are back at the cutting mat. I have got one of these self-healing cutting mats. You can pick them up most places online or in craft stores or art stores. I prefer to use it because I'm using quite a sharp little blade here, which is a bit dirty. It means that I'm not going to cut through anything which is important. So there's nothing underneath this, and I've also got a steel ruler so that I can actually make a nice even line across the center. I will just mark the corners first. Now you need to get the end of this right close to the stitching without actually going through it, and push hard and come back to make the V. You want to have quite a big V so that you can fold it back. There's no point in having a tiny little V because you will need to stitch through the other side when you are putting, when you're folding, you need to have something to fold back. So I'm just going to turn this, and I'm going to go really close to the corner, and I'm going to cut back to that center line. Make sure I'm through to the mat, and same again here. And then I'm going to use my steel rule just to cut this center line. Make it nice and even, but don't go too far. You just want to come to where you've cut here, down to the point. If any of your cuts aren't quite through, like here, I can just use my scissors to snip. Turn this round, snip into those corners. Again, not going through. Not going through the stitching. So now I have a post box. Looks like I haven't quite gone through all the layers there. There we go. We now, what they say is you post your fabric through. This is why it's right side down, right side to right side, because this is now going through the hole. All the edges, and it will fold on your stitching line. So what I usually do is I usually get it through, and this is why you want quite a big triangle. It comes through, like so, and then what we do is we make sure it's pressed on that seam fold. So I'm going to go and do that now, and then I'll come back to you. So here we are. I've now opened that out and pressed it, so you can see it's nice and sharp, and we have got a nice clean opening on the front side. So the next thing we need to do is pin the zip into this hole so that it's lined up, and then we need to stitch really close to the edge on the outside to hold the zip in place. When positioning the zip, we want the pull on this side, the right hand side, so that we've got a nice even opening. It's just a bit sticky, my zip. So that means if we want it this end, when we flip it over, it's on this side. So what I generally do is take my pull and put it through the gap so that butts up nicely. And then what I do is pin the tape so that it holds. This is just rough at the moment because I can't tell if this is nice and even. So I need to flip it back to the other side to make sure that my zip is in the center of my post box. So now what I'm going to do is use my pins and pin through from this side into the tape on the rear side to keep it nice and even. And so on until we're completely pinned. And when we get to this end, it should be held enough that I can take the pins out from the back and reverse it. So now I'm completely pinned in. You may see that I've got a couple of extra pins this end. This is to hold the tape, and this end I have got one pin which is holding the tape that end. And if I flip it over, you can see where I'm holding the tape this end, and I'm holding the tape this end. The other thing I've got to do is to pin this, because underneath the machine, when you're turning it, this could flip over there, which has happened to me before, and then you've sewn around it and you have to unpick everything and reinsert your zip again. So on the right side, make sure that you have a couple of pins just to hold this in place. So you can see they're now held in place, so this is going nowhere. So we're now going back to the machine. You may have noticed that my pins are going in opposite directions, and this is the way I sew. So I will be sewing from here first, this way, round the corner, and then round, so that the join will be in the centre, middle at the bottom. Back at the sewing machine, and you may have noticed that I've changed my presser foot. This is a universal zip presser foot. It basically attaches via this screw here. The bit that came off is this bit, which is where you actually just normally clip in your presser feet. It attaches here, but this one has a screw at the back which allows you to adjust the foot across, which means that you can get really close to your seam. So this needs to be tightened to there. It needs to come a little way, because you always check that your needle will actually go through. And then see, my needle perfectly fits in the gap. I'll take another angle for this so that you can see it better. I'm zoomed in quite a long way, so it may be a little bit blurry, but if you can see here, my needle just matches that hole exactly, and the edge of my presser foot now, my zip foot, is right along the edge of where I want to sew my zip. So I'm going to continue to put my zip in place, and then I'll show you what it looks like once I've inserted it. I thought I'd show you this bit coming to the zip pull, because normally you have problems with a standard foot that you can't move the zip pull. So what I'm going to do here is sew really close up to the zip pull, making sure that my fabric is lined up with the edge of the presser foot. Get to here, and I'm going to leave my needle in the machine. I can lift my pull. I've probably gone a little bit too far, but I can then ease that past, and then I can continue right to the end, which is where I'm going to turn. So you see, using this particular foot makes things a lot easier, particularly when you've got zips that you want to insert like this. And there we have it, one zipper insertion, nice and working. And if I zoom in, you can see how close to the edge you can actually stitch. So stitching is really close to the edge. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of roll over there, but that's because I'm zoomed in so much. So the next thing we do is to finish the pocket off, is to flip it over, and then we need to pin the other pocket piece, which I've already done, to the pocket that we're putting on. And then all we need to do is stitch around these edges, making sure that we don't stitch through the bag itself. So when it comes to these bits here, you'll need to fold this back like so, and make sure you stitch along here. But I'll be stitching this way, and then when we get to this bit here, this corner, we'll fold that bit of the bag under so that we're not catching any of the bag. I'm just going to pop that on the machine now. I've switched the presser foot back to the standard presser foot, and I'll show you this when it's completed. We're not going to trim this bit of the zipper off. It's going to sit within the bag because there's going to be a backing piece on here, and this pocket will be hidden within the confines of the bag itself, so there's no need to trim that off. You could, but what I would suggest is if you do, you need to run 2 or 3 stitches across here, sort of like a bar tack, just to stop the zipper pull going too far. And there we are, there's the pocket finished. If you want extra strength at the bottom of your pocket, you can always fold up both layers and then stitch. And then of course you've actually got an extra bit of securing here, which means that this pocket is actually slightly stronger. I'll show you from this side. You can open the zip, and then you've got a nice pocket inside your bag. There we go. You can also repeat this on the other side. I only do it on the front of the bag. You can repeat this on the back of the bag if you wanted to, and again it's basically just the same process. The next step in making of this bag is to attach the side pieces, but they need interfacing first. Now I've already interfaced 3 pieces, and this is the final piece. It is the right side. You can see that, you may be able to see that this side is just slightly shinier, but that's the way to tell, and it also feels slightly sticky. Now, what I recommend when you're actually doing this is to use a bit of a pressing cloth. Now you can use different sort of weights of pressing cloth for different things. I use calico because I have a lot of calico because I make slopers or toiles from it. So put it over the top, particularly if you're using your good iron. And then the idea is follow the instructions, and you basically don't move the iron. You press and then lift and then press. I'm not particularly very good at this because I tend to slide the iron. I tend to sort of press in one place and then slide, lift slightly and slide. And unfortunately what that can do is it can actually start making this rough, particularly with this type of interfacing. If you've got a woven interfacing, it's better, but it is a lot more expensive. And as this is a bag which is going to have some foam attached, I'm just using a fairly standard lightweight interfacing. And because you're actually using quite a high heat, I'm not using any steam on this one, but do check the instructions for the specific interfacing that you're using. You could also scorch, which again is one of the reasons why I'm using the pressing cloth. So once you've done this all over, and you need to leave it for a good few seconds in each place, then it's fused. No damage to the piece. Okay, so what we're now going to do is again to attach these pieces to the sides of the bags, and I'll come back and show you when they're attached. So I now have 2 complete sides of the bag. Seams are sewn and pressed open. It is quite a narrow seam. As I said, it's a ½ centimetre seam, not a centimetre seam as I originally thought. Now the next thing that we need to do is to strengthen these sides, and that's where the thin foam comes in. Now I searched high and low for thin foam, and I couldn't find anything which was the right size. So in the end I ended up getting carpet underlay, or laminate flooring underlay. The first one I got for the first bag was too thick. It's 5mm, and with all the layers that you need to sew through, my machine struggled. If you've got an industrial machine which can cope with that sort of thickness, absolutely fine. But what I've found is you can get this 3mm carpet underlay, or laminate flooring underlay. This one is great because it's actually got a waterproof membrane on one side, so this side is going to go to the outside of the bag, so it will go that way. You can see there is a little bit of ridging, so that's why I'm laying it this way rather than that way. And then what you do is you take your bag side, and then just making sure that the pocket isn't trapped, because the pocket is now going to be between this layer and the outer layer. So just make sure on both sides that your pocket is down, and then you pin this to the foam. I'm only pinning it in a couple of places because I don't really want to have too many holes in that waterproofing, but it should actually help if the bag gets wet to keep the contents inside dry. Probably won't completely because the top of the bag will be open, but at least it will help if you get, you know, sort of splashed on the sides, whatever. The next thing we do is, once we've actually pinned this, get the final pin in, we then stitch really close to the edge. Now, because this bag has got just a 5mm seam allowance, I'm going to stitch at 5mm, and then when I actually sew the sides, I'm going to go slightly more than 5mm, maybe 6 or 7, just so that I hide that bit of stitching. It won't make a huge amount of difference to the bag because you're just taking it in ever so slightly at the sides. So over to the machine now, and then we will sew this on. So here we are at the machine ready to sew. I'm lining up my fabric with the edge of my presser foot, and my needle is over so that this is 1/2 centimetre. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sew round. Now, because we're going through quite thick fabrics this time, and also we're going through the foam, the needle size is important. Don't use a 60 or a 70 because that's for finer fabrics. Use something like a 90 or a 100. This is a 90, I think, so that at least you can actually get through the fabric and also the foam. You can get artist's foam, but as I said, I've not been able to find it in the right size. You need to make sure that your foam is bigger than the actual piece that you're sewing, which means that you can't use your seam guide. You do have to use the edge of your presser foot or line it up with something else that you can actually see as you're going around the edge of the bag. Now, when you are sewing through this particular foam, because it's quite aerated, it does sound like it's popping a lot. Now that's fine. It does work, I know, because I've used it on the other bag that you saw earlier. So I'm just going to start. I'm not going to go video the whole lot of me going around, but I'm going to start again holding the cotton at the back, starting just slightly away from the edge. I'm not going to double stitch back because I'm going to go round and come back over this way, because of course this will then be folded in when the lining goes on and understitched. So I will already do that. But if you listen to how it sounds, it does sound a bit weird when you're sewing this. Now, I don't know if you could hear the popping, but I certainly can. But I'm going to go round the two and then next stage. So here's the bag side stitched to the foam. And the next thing you need to do is, of course, trim it. So this has been trimmed. Don't use your fabric scissors, just use ordinary paper scissors. Or you can use a Stanley knife as well if you are, or a craft knife if you are comfortable with cutting that close to the fabric without slicing into it. This side, as you can see, has got the zip in it. We will at one point put a ribbon through the ring pull so that it's easier to find it, but you can actually see through here that the pocket is now sandwiched behind the foam. So that pocket now, it's a nice solid pocket which is sandwiched inside the foam. Next thing we're going to do is, before we tackle the lining, and after I've trimmed this one off, we're going to put the clasp closure and the clasp together. Here we are ready to make the tab up. There's another interesting issue with the pattern instructions here, because it says to place the shaped piece of interfacing in the middle of the square tab. Now on the picture it shows more fabric around the outside. It doesn't really matter because it actually fits. So we put interfacing on the back of the main fabric and the back of the lining fabric, and I've ironed those on. And the next thing to do is to make sure that the wadding also gets ironed on there. So this is the iron-on wadding, and this time I am going to use a pressing cloth just to be on the safe side. So we're going to press that to stick the wadding down. And there we go. I have a slight issue. Normally this will be thick enough for most clasps, but I've got this absolutely beautiful bee clasp because my flatmate loves bees, and her nickname when she's playing roller derby is Tumblebee. But it is quite wide. You can see that there's quite a wide gap there, and that is as narrow as it will go because it's screwed on. So I'm going to add a piece of foam into the middle so that I've got the correct thickness of fabric. Next step is to actually sandwich these all together and to sew them right close to the line here. I'm just going to trim these edges off because I haven't got a big piece of fabric. I'm just going to trim the edges off and just sew very, very close to the edge. So here's my tab sewn. You'll notice I've notched it and taken some bits off the end, and I've also trimmed the foam very close to the stitching line because I don't want that thickness when I turn it. So we're now going to turn this. Hopefully it'll turn quite easily, even with the foam. There we go. There we go. There's our tab. Next thing we need to do is put the mail onto the bag. So we'll just get the bag and we'll attach the mail. So we're ready to put the mail part of the fastening into our bag. As you can see, I've already marked the center point and where I want it to go. So what I need to do now is offer up this part equally either side, and I'm just going to make another mark either side. Just make sure that they line up. Perfect. And now what I'm going to do is, I'm back on my cutting mat as you can see, and I'm just going to use my sharp knife and put a couple of slits through where I've actually marked. Just need to be very careful here that you don't cut too far. There you go. As long as you can feel that you're cutting into the mat, you're fine. Then we just offer that up. Just make sure that it goes through. Just need to make a bit more of a cut here. Like that. Perfect. And it slots through to the back side. Now before I actually put the back on, I'm going to take that out and I'm going to use some of this fray check over those holes. And all that will mean is that the fabric shouldn't fray now once this is in place. So offer that up again, make sure that it's going the right way. So in this case, the body of the bee has to come down. That's fine. And then we flip it over and we take the back plate and we put the back plate on over our prongs. It looks like it's going to be those two. And then fingers to bend them out. Nice and tight. And there we are. There's my bee clasp done. The next thing to do is to actually put the top bit into the tab. And so we're just going to make sure that we measure it and make sure it goes into approximately the right place, which is there. And then we're going to mark it up, and then we're going to cut that hole, and then we're going to attach it. I've taken the back plate off my clasp and put the screws somewhere very safe. And I've also marked the center point. You can probably just see the white line there of my pocket. And I placed the clasp in place right here. All I'm going to do now is mark the two holes and also that center so that I have got an idea where I'm actually going to cut. These two I will just use with a brad awl, but I will actually cut out the center. So I'm just going to mark those now. So you can see the markings, and now I'm just going to cut those out. So I've cut my hole. You can see that this fits. I found that it was easier to cut a big hole which everything goes through rather than try and do the two smaller holes. And now before I actually push this through and put the screws in, the tiny little screws there, I'm going to actually again use my fray check so that the edges don't fray. So there we have it. It's in place and it's nicely screwed in. You can see that's nice and neat, and profile is fine. It's actually sandwiching quite nicely. This particular clasp has been a lot more fiddly than I thought it was going to be, but I think the results are worth it. If I now bring the other part of the bag over, open the clasp, and there we have a finished clasp. What I'm going to do now is bring the other side of the bag across, put the two together, line them up, and then turn over so that I can attach this to here, or at least mark where it goes. So I now know that it will line up correctly when I sew it on. So that's the next thing to do, is to sew this on. So we take it back off there, and then we would sew it on there. And you may have noticed when I turned this that what I did was I actually cut down the foam, and I might just need to trim it a little bit more so that when I stitch I'm not catching the foam in that section. So my tab is now sewn on, nice and neat, still the 1/2 centimetre seam allowance, and as you may notice that it's right side to right side, because this is the bit that fastens. And then when we turn it over, we now have a nice fastening bag with a little bit of a gap at the top, so that you can actually sort of have some width, put some stuff in there so it doesn't close too tight. Now this is all done, which is great, we now need to move on to the lining, putting the lining pockets in. In the pattern it says for the pockets which are popper pockets that you just use fusible interfacing on the back of the pocket. Now for me that's not finished correctly, so what I've done is I have actually cut 2 pieces for my popper pocket so that both sides, the inside of the bag and the inside of the pocket, has the lining fabric on it. But I'll show you that when we get to it. So I've cut my 2 pieces of lining material. They're exactly the same size and shape as the outer pieces. On this side, which is the back, I'm going to put another zipped welt pocket. So this is my pattern piece. For this, it's 22.5 by 24 centimeters, and then the zip pocket marking is 2.5 centimeters down from the top, 1 centimeter deep as per usual, and 2.5 centimeters in from each side. But I'm also using this, I folded out, to make my patch pocket piece, and that is 32 by 24 centimeters, but we'll come on to that one in a moment. So what I need to do with this is make sure that I've marked my zip hole again, my welt. So you can see that's already marked on there. I've marked it in black so it's easy to see, and you can probably see that there is a white mark here. That's my center point. I've also marked my center point in white here. So what I need to do is line up my 2 center points and put the pocket where I think is going to look the best. Now, I don't want it too close to the bottom, because of course the bottom is going to fold up. So it needs to go a little bit closer to the top, but not too close to the top, because there will be a seam allowance there as well. So I think we're probably all right with that. If the pocket does fold slightly underneath, yeah, whatever. I think what I might do is I might actually just reduce the depth of that by that. I think that'll make much more sense. So that's what I'll do. I'm just going to quickly press that, and then I'll match my other piece to match. I'll cut it to match. Then what I'm going to do is pin this and then stitch like I did before all around the outside of my black line, and then I'm going to cut and then fold through again like I did before. Here we are. So like we did before, I stitched around, I slit it, made sure I went right into the corners, but not cutting the stitching line, and then folded through, posted through and pressed. One thing I did do though was I actually reduced the width of this gap by 1 centimeter each side, so it's now 3.5 centimeters each side, because I realized that if I was keeping it the width that I had, then I would have been sewing right over this metal piece of the zip when I was inserting the zip, and I didn't want to do that. So I've actually reduced the size slightly so that I won't be doing that. And then again, we just insert the zip exactly the same as we did before. Make sure that we pin it in, and then when we flip it the other side, probably turn it round, make sure that it's centered in that gap. So I'm going to do that now. You've seen this before, so I'm just going to whiz on and do this and then show you the completed pocket. So here we have our pocket finished, internal pocket on the back lining piece. Zipper works quite nicely, and as you can see, I've used contrast material for the lining. And then if I turn it over, you can see that the pocket bag is complete, finished. I'll just trim off those bits of thread later. So that's nice and complete and finished, and the next thing we need to do is move on to the patch pocket, which is going onto the front piece. So here's my front piece of lining. If you are using pattern material, you can try and pattern match. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough material left to be able to pattern match. So I've cut my two pieces of patch pocket. My lining, or my interior, I wanted as the contrast. You can use the same material, but I like a contrast. So what we need to do first is interface the main fabric. Oops. Interface the main fabric, and then we're going to put them right sides together, and we are going to stitch around this bottom, across the top and back down the side. We're going to leave the bottom open because that's where we're going to turn it through this bottom opening, and then when we stitch this on, we'll turn the bottom opening up so that we've got a nice firm seam at the bottom. So I'm just going to stitch this together now, and then I'll show you how I trim it so that I can turn it. Here's my patch pocket, all sewn. I've taken a 1 centimetre seam allowance on this. It just gives me a little bit more when I'm attaching it to the inside to actually stitch into. It just makes it a little bit more secure. So when I'm trimming, this is the open end. So we'll trim these bottom corners first. So what you want to do is really close to the stitching, but not cutting through it. Cut at 45 degrees. I think I just got the stitching there. And then what I do is I come at a slightly more acute angle both ways, just to give it a little bit more. Hopefully you can see that point now. So it's not just cut at 45 degrees. I've then cut it at a couple of other angles as well, just so that that corner is nice and sharp. So the same again on this corner. So get my scissors in close, cut at 45 degrees, and then we're going to cut a sharp angle there and a sharp angle there. So we've got nice sharp angles ready to turn. At the top, where I'm going to turn it, or in this case the bottom, I'm also going to cut at quite a sharp angle, just so that when I turn it, there's not an awful lot of seam allowance sitting there right next to the turn. And the same again on this side. So I'm going to come at quite a sharp angle and cut that piece off. Now when I turn it, you've probably noticed I've got a couple of chopsticks. I've got a sharp pointed one in case I need to get right into the corner, and I've got a slightly more blunted one. This means that you can't push through the stitching if you're close. So it's very simple. You just turn, make sure that you know where your corner is, and push through. Same again on the other side. Get rid of any scrap bits. Make sure you know where your corner is, and just push through and turn. If this isn't quite through fully, you can use your chopstick just to help push that last bit of fabric through. Don't know if you saw, but let's try the other side. You can see that that's actually not quite through yet, so we'll just push it through with a chopstick, and you can just see that it's now got a nice sharp corner. What I'm going to do before I attach this is I'm going to press it, and I'm also going to top stitch along here about 0.5 centimetre to 1 centimetre in, just to secure that edge. When you are top stitching this, you can always open it and press your seam open first. I tend not to. because if you fold it and press it, you can usually get a nice crisp seam line like that. So here's my patch pocket, all nicely pressed. I've top stitched it across the top, that's a centimetre in, and I have also turned over about a centimetre and pressed it at the bottom. I've also marked centre point here and centre point here. You probably can't see it, but if I bring this closer, there's a little white mark there. There's a white mark there to line up with. So I want to make sure that this is deep enough in the bag, but not so deep, because this bottom piece will become the bottom of the bag. So I'm going to take it up a little bit. Then next thing to do is pin it, and then we stitch really close to the edge on those three corners, on those, well, those three sides, not corners. So I'm going to pin, and then I'm going to stitch it. And then the next thing we're going to do is put the popper on. I've already got my centre line marked here and on the back. The difficulty with the popper is, unless you've got a specific tool to do it, you're going to have to use a hammer. So you can either have the popper or not have the popper. I'm going to put one on, and I'll show you what it looks like with a popper on it. But I'm going to stitch it, and then I'll probably pop the popper on and show you how it's done. So here we are. My pocket is all on and edge stitched. And when you edge stitch or top stitch, take your time. You're not running a race, and you'll get a much neater and more even stitch, particularly if you take your time. So if I just zoom in a bit and just show you on the edge, that you can see I've got a nice, neat, even line. So this is my popper kit. So zoom out a little bit, there you go. So this is the stud, the popper, and there's the stud, and these bits come with it to hammer it in. This is known as a tailor's awl, and it's just nice and easy to make holes in your fabric. And what will happen is, because it widens, it rather than just make a hole, it will actually push its way through the fibres and move them aside, so you're actually saving cutting through them, which means that there's less likely to be any breaks. One thing that I do though, this is quite thick, so I don't need to do any reinforcement on that. Smooth this out of the way. But on the back, where I'm going to put the popper, I've actually reinforced here with some woven interfacing. Now this is more expensive than the standard interfacing, but I've got two pieces on here, and it just helps strengthen this, so that when I put the hole through it for the stud, it's going to hold much, much better. So I would put the popper on first, so that I know exactly where it's going to go. So it's going to go approximately there. So if I press, I got a bit of a hole. Let's just do that again. I want it down a bit. You can see a bit of a hole there. I don't know if you can see that. But then I'm going to put my awl through. Just push. And can you see I've got a nice clean hole. I'll bring this up to the camera a bit. So I've got a nice clean hole here, so that the end of this can go through, and then I can put this bit on and then use my tool to open that out. I'm going to do that now, and then I'm going to put the back popper on and show you when I've completed it. So the popper's on, and you can see, and it pops together and comes apart. I really need to get a proper press for putting these on. Using the hammer is not great. I actually managed to ruin 4 which wouldn't pop before I actually got this one to go on. So it really does make a difference what sort of tool that you've got. The one that I've got, which just said you use the hammer, I don't find particularly good. As I said, these sides I take about 4 or 5 attempts to actually get a good one on. Fortunately, the metal is actually quite soft, so you can actually just use pliers to get it back off again. Next step that we've got to do is we actually start the full construction of the bag. Everything's together now, the lining's together, the outside is together. And the next thing to do is actually put everything together and construct the bag. So the first step of constructing the bag is to take the two outer pieces, put them right sides together, like so, and then what we're going to do is we're going to stitch down the edges, across the bottom and up the other side. Now you may need to give your machine a little bit of assistance when you're doing this because of the thickness of the layers. You can see there's quite a lot. You may need to give your machine a little bit of assistance when actually doing this. So I'm going to stitch it and then come back and show you the next step. So I've sewn my edges. I would suggest if you've got an industrial machine that you use that, or a heavy duty machine you use that. My machine still struggled even with a 3mm, but I think maybe next time if I flipped this over so the shinier side is on the outside, it might struggle less. So the next step is what they call boxing out, because at the moment that doesn't look much like a bag. So what we do is we take the corners and we open them out so that the seams hit each other like that. Can you see? So I'm just matching the seam here with the side seam there. So that's the bottom seam with the side seam. And then what we do is we measure up 4 centimeters from the corner. We make a mark all the way across, and then we stitch across that 4 centimeter mark to hold all of that together. And then we repeat the same on the other side. So I'll just do that and then I'll come back to you. Right, so I've boxed out the corners. I've sewn them. You can see across there. If your machine is struggling a bit, I suggest you start just before the center and move to the edge and then come off the edge and then tie the cotton and go back the other way, which is what I've done on both of these edges. Next thing to do then, because we don't want this piece, is to actually take our scissors and cut close to the stitching line and take that corner piece off. Same on this side. And take that corner piece off. Now you can see that it's beginning to look more like a bag, particularly on the inside. And if I quickly flip this right side out, there we go. Where we squared off the bottom on both sides. Got some loose cotton thread. And then we squared off the bottom there, which means that the bag will actually stand like so. And then we can close it and stand it like so. Next thing we've got to do is do basically the same with the lining fabric. However, with the lining fabric, we are not going to completely sew across the bottom. We're going to leave a gap of about 20 centimeters because this is where we turn the whole thing through. It goes through the bottom there. So I've stitched my linings right sides together and left a gap in the middle here, and as you may also see, I've also boxed out the corners. Right, so this is now ready to go into the main bag. So make sure you get your bits the right way round. So my zip pocket needs to go on my back, opposite the other one. Actually make sure they need to go right sides together. So right side of the lining goes inside the bag, and that flap needs to be on the inside as well. And then we will just pin all around the edges, making sure that we match our seams, pin all around the edges, and then we're going to stitch all around the edge to line the two together, and then we'll turn it out through the bit in the bottom. To strengthen the bottom, we are going to use a piece of this, which we will then cut once we know the exact measurements of the bottom. And that is some plastic canvas. Sorry, I forgot what it was for a moment. Some plastic canvas. Again, you can get this from art shops or various different suppliers. It's a little bit flexible, but it's also quite stiff, so it actually just helps support the bottom of the bag. The other thing that we need to do is to put some studs into the bottom of the bag. I will do that before I actually put the lining in, so I'll show you how I put those in. So this is the bottom of the bag. As you can see, it's nice and square now. And what we're going to do, and excuse the state of my fingers, it's all the colouring that I've been doing to try and match this up. We're going to put these bag feet, these, into the bottom of the bag. You will need to open up these bits here first, because they come closed like so. So you need to open these up, but you need to position them onto the bottom of your bag, mark the positions, and then, like we did before, we're just going to cut some holes, put some fray check, push them through, and then on the inside they're going to go through here, and we're just going to fold them back. So I've got my studs in place now. These have all been fixed, and if I show you quickly on the inside, you can see that they've been folded over through the studs. Let's just see if I can zoom in on those. Yes, there we go. So they've been pressed through, and they're just finger tight, because this is now going to be inside the lining, so it'll be fine. So now I can get on with actually attaching the lining back into the bag. My bag's stitched together. I took a 1 centimetre seam allowance around the top, just to give myself that little bit of extra security. And now I've just got to turn it through the hole in the lining. This can be a little bit tricky, so I'm not going to show you this part. I'm going to let you work that one out yourself, but I'll show you what it looks like when I've turned it right side out. So the bag's turned right side out. We will need to top stitch it, because as you can see, the lining is beginning to roll, so we need to make sure that that is nice and tight. We're going to top stitch across here, just across here, to prevent this lining from rolling to the top, because there is some seam allowance in there. So we're going to do that. I've also cut my plastic canvas to size. I measured my bottom, and that should fit. And so what we're going to do is we're going to slot that in underneath the lining. You can glue it in. I prefer to leave it just as it is. And you just push it in, and that just gives some extra security to the bottom. With this open seam on the bottom, all we're going to do is press it, fold it in against each other, and then we're going to top stitch. I mean, you can slip stitch it by hand if you want to, but we're going to just top stitch once that's folded in. Press that, and then we're going to just top stitch it really close to the fold, because it's in the bottom of the bag and nobody will see it. Right, so now we've top stitched around the edge of the bag after it was pinned, which is now holding the lining in place, and it's not rolling anymore. I've actually stitched it 1 centimetre here, just to keep it nice and neat, and I've also top stitched the lining in the bottom. I've stitched, I don't know if you can see that, very, very close to the edge, and I've used a matching thread colour, so it's very, very difficult to see, and that keeps it nice and neat. So the next thing we're going to have to do is attach the handles. Now this particular pattern recommends leather handles. Now I did order some leather in the right width, which is 1 centimetre, but looking at it against the bag, it doesn't really go. It probably doesn't look like it on the video, but it for me, it doesn't actually go. It certainly doesn't go with the purple. So I've decided that I'm going to use some webbing. Now webbing comes in various different thicknesses and colours, lots and lots of different colours, and this 25mm or 2.5 centimetre width is actually quite cheap. It's only about a fiver for 10 metres. So this is really quite good. So my flatmate has decided, she was torn with a rainbow, but she decided in the end that she wanted to go with the pink. And it's quite nice because it also pinks up the pinks in this other fabric that we've got. So that's going to work. And the straps are going to be fixed here and lining up with the bottom of these squares. Now we need 80 centimetres twice to cut this. Once we've cut it, we will need to seal the end. And to do that, what we do is we actually use either a lighter or a match. Now I haven't got a lighter, so I'm going to use a match, and I'm going to show you how to seal the end with a match. I'm going to use a long cook's match so that I don't get too close to my fingers when it burns down. Okay, so I've cut my two 80 centimetre lengths of webbing, and the edges of this now are raw, and they will start to fray because it's literally just woven plastic. So what we need to do is we need to seal the ends of these. Now you have to be careful because I'm going to be using a match, but we are not actually going to burn the ends of this. We're going to get the match close, and you will see that the ends will melt without the flame not actually even touching the cord. So I'm using a really long matchstick to keep my fingers well away, and I just need to pull it close, and you'll be able to see the edges are just melting slightly. That's all you need to do. The edge has melted ever so slightly, and it's now sealed that edge. The other thing that you must remember to do once you've done this is also to seal the edge of your raw end on the roll that you've got left, otherwise that will start to fray as well. Back at the sewing machine, and now that I've lined up my tapes, I'm just going to stitch around in a square and then across the centre. You may just be able to make out that I have marked my diagonals with pencil. This just gives me a nice line to be able to follow as I stitch through. So we're going to go round in a square, pivoting at the corners. Just be careful when you do this because there's so much bulk of the bag over on this side, that it's going to be tricky when you're actually pivoting. So just take your time. I'm going to take the time, and I'm going to put all of the straps on, so all 4, and then I've got one more step to do before we complete the bag. So I've sewn on my handles, and having done it with the lining in place, I've realised this is probably not the best time to sew the handles on. The best time to sew the handles on, if you're using this sort of method to strengthen them, would be before you insert the lining. So in the video I'll make sure that there is some text on the bottom to say that that's the best place to do it. You can just use rivets to hold your handles on. Now that would work perfectly well if you're using the leather, but with webbing I prefer to have a little bit more security. But these are basically what I'm going to use. It's a two-part rivet, a long piece and a short piece which fits onto the top and clicks in place. Then what you need to do is you need to use the tool, which has got a base like this, which the rivet sits in, and a piece on top which fits, and then you will bang it together with a hammer, and that will just force the rivet closed in there. So I'm going to put 2 rivets on each strap, one in the top triangle and one in the bottom triangle, just to hold them secure. So they will look a bit like so. You can do as many rivets as you want. Notice that I have left some strap loose here. That would also work particularly well if you're inserting the lining, but it's just so that you're not right up against the top of the bag. To punch my holes, I'm going to use one of these leather punches. This one is quite a strong one. It's not a cheap one, It's a slightly more expensive one, but it does actually have more push to it, and it will actually go through more layers. So here we are, finished bag. The rivets are now in. 2 nice rivets. The tool works very, very well. You need to hit it 2 or 3 times, but you can see that they're nice and secure, and they will hold that strap. I am glad that I did some sewing on it as well, because I think that will just make it a little bit more secure, but this just finishes it off. But I will make sure that the straps are put on before, in future, before I put the lining in. So here we are. Here's the finished bag. Handles and everything, and a little few finishing touches like a little bit of ribbon there and there. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to try and do one at least every month if I can. And if there's anything that you would like to see me do, collars, cats, anything like that, please let me know. Apologies for the length of this video, but it is the first one and I'm sure I'll get better as I go along. Thanks for watching, and if you feel like it, hit the subscribe button. Bye.